What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. So, today I want to talk to you about psychopaths, the evolution of psychopathy, and its relationship with attractiveness and relationships in general. Let's go forward. We're going to be looking at this paper here called Psychopathy and the Induction of Desire, Formulating and Testing an Evolutionary Hypothesis. But I want to go over some general facts about psychopathy, explain what it is, kind of relate it to some dating discourse, make it kind of interesting for people that aren't familiar with psychopathy and these kinds of topics. So, going into that first, understanding psychopathy, what is it? One use of the term in psychology is to describe a trait, a continuum, and people fall on different points in that continuum. Some people can score higher in psychopathy, some people lower in psychopathy, right? You see that in the dark triad, you see that in the 3-factor model of psychopathy, and you can also see that in the 4-factor model of psychopathy. The term is also used to categorize individuals binarily, right? Psychopath, not a psychopath. And that's basically someone that gets a very high score, a cutoff, which is arbitrary, on the HARE psychopathy checklist. So we're still talking about kind of the same thing. It's probably the case that all behavior and personality is on a spectrum, rather than someone being a psychopath or not. Going forward in this paper, we're going to be looking at the 4-factor model of psychopathy, but I'll explain the 3 and the 4. They're pretty similar to give you more of a background. 3-factor model. So, 3 factors of psychopathy. What are those? An interpersonal factor. The interactions people have with other human beings, right? Tends to be arrogant and deceitful, right? So characterized by manipulation. Second factor, psychopaths have deficient affect or flat emotions. They don't feel empathy, guilt as much, right? Some people say they don't feel it. They might, but a little bit. Their emotions may be damp. They might not feel fear as much as well, which can be related to impulse control. And the third one specifically, impulsive and irresponsible behavior. That's something you will see in diagnostic criteria. I should say antisocial personality disorder is diagnosed, but in assessment criteria, like in the HARE psychopathy checklist. Let's go forward. This is the 4-factor model of psychopathy from the HARE PCI, okay? 4 factors: interpersonal, affective, lifestyle, and antisocial. So, interpersonal behaviors with others. I'm just going to go over some of these, but you can pause it and look here. Superficial charm, right? Grandiose self-worth, lots of manipulation, lots of lying. Lifestyle, they tend to be impulsive, seeking stimulation, and also kind of irresponsible, right? They lack goals as well. Affective, as we mentioned, the lack of guilt, the lack of remorse, shallow affect, so they don't feel things as strongly, be it empathy or be it compassion, love, any kind of emotion tends to be flat for these individuals. And antisocial, which is a lot of behavior, and it's related specifically to kind of criminal behavior, a lot of these items on the checklist. Poor behavioral controls, often they emerge early in life. We see juvenile delinquency as well. Revocation of conditional release is one on here, so people that do get in trouble, they tend to keep getting in trouble while on probation or parole. And criminal versatility is interesting because it means people commit crimes across multiple different areas. So you might have someone that gets into fights and is a thief and does all of these different kinds of crimes, so they're always in trouble for different things. Whereas, it's actually kind of common, relatively, for people to break laws and that sort of thing, but often it's just a one-off or it's dedicated to a specific thing as opposed to broad antisocial behavior kind of across the board. Let's go on now and ask another question, because this gets kind of caught up in a lot of dating discourse. Are psychopaths bad boys, right? We tend to have the cultural belief that women like bad boys, and this is something that comes out in a lot of research as well, that there are kind of a bad boy image, right? Which can include some antisocial behavior, but often is just a physical perception of someone who looks maybe more macho. But are psychopaths bad boys? Do they fit this image behaviorally or otherwise, right? Sometimes they do, but often they don't. And the reason for this is because psychopaths are mimics of pro-social behavior, okay? What really characterizes psychopaths in many ways is that they come across as, at least superficially at first, contact, and maybe they can maintain this for a while as kind of good people, right? They mimic good behaviors, right? It's often not kind of a carefree, rebel without a cause, bad boy who's just breaking rules, and it's clearly obvious that they don't care. This is someone that wants to make you think that they do. Let's look at an example tied up in a lot of this dating discourse, right? Jeremy Meeks, the hot felon. People love this guy because the idea is that he's an example of how looks matter, personality supposedly does not. Why? Because apparently people believe he's a terrible person because he committed some crimes, and he's very conventionally attractive, so he's landed a model gig and all of that. So yeah, looks matter and behavior apparently doesn't. What is his history criminally? Well, he committed one robbery at the age of 18. He robbed and assaulted a younger man who was 16. And then later in 2014, gun possession, okay? So he doesn't have an extensive criminal history. I believe he was a gang member, you know, the crime iceberg. What he got caught for is probably just a fraction of what he did, but whatever the case may be, it's not someone that typically has at least the antisocial behavior pattern that we would see with a lot of psychopaths in jail, you know, where they have a criminal record spanning dozens and dozens and dozens of different crimes over time. This is someone who importantly seems to have gotten out of that, which is often not what you see with psychopaths. So, next slide here. He's probably not a psychopath, right? And I put probably not a psychopathy I'm reading now, but he's probably not a psychopath, okay? He has a sparse criminal history. Most delinquents are not actually psychopaths, okay? So if you see this behavior in someone, you can't immediately jump to, you know, I think that person is a psychopath. In most cases, they're not going to be, even for serious criminals. Even for people who are in a gang, murderers, mafia members. There have been studies on psychopathy and convicted mafia members in prisons in Italy. About 20% of them do actually score high enough to be characterized as psychopaths. In the general population, it's about 4 to 8%. So pretty high rate in criminal populations, higher, but still, it's not most criminals, not even most serious criminals. Importantly, what do we see here? We see he followed a pattern that is kind of the normal age crime curve drop-off. And what is the age crime curve? It's a well-replicated observation in criminology that most crime, particularly most violent crime, but crime across the board, is committed by young men between age 16 and 25. So you can see, if you imagine a distribution of age and crimes, it goes up at that age and then it abruptly drops off. Even most people who have committed serious crimes in the past, in that age range, they desist from it. Okay, but when people don't, when you see persistent criminal behavior across the lifespan, that's when you have to start wondering, like, is there some antisocial personality disorder going on here? Something like that, okay? We see he did some antisocial aggression, right? But actually that's pretty common. Most people don't get arrested for it, but a lot of young men do engage in it. So it's not abnormal male behavior. It's not something, you know, that we would expect to be characteristic of a psychopath. But let's go on to the next slide and look at someone else. This is the BTK killer, okay? He was a church deacon, Cub Scout leader, but he had repeated kind of failures across his life, right? Failed at the university, failed at the Air Force, okay? Went from job to job, but he was married for decades. And at the same time, he had a prolonged history of criminal behavior and antisocial behavior, but it was often kind of minor. So here we see someone that does seem to fit the pattern of a psychopath. Criminal behavior that began very early in life, you know, torturing animals, zoophilia, that sort of a thing. Consistent behavior across the lifespan, even kind of into old age as well. And consistent attitudes across the lifespan. He had a strong disdain for women, for example, that he would, you know, it came out later that he was always kind of giving women at work a hard time and that sort of a thing. But he was married for a long time. He was a church deacon. He was able to put up that facade that he was a pillar of the community, so to speak. Not a bad boy, right? Not someone anyone would think was a bad boy, but it turns out he was, in fact, a very bad person. And looking at this slide, this is what I described, this facade of normalities, what has been called the mask of sanity, characteristic of psychopaths. This is a term that was coined by Hervey Cleckley, okay, when he wrote a book called The Mask of Sanity. A feature of psychopaths is that they're able to pass as normal. You cannot always tell who they are. They can be very convincing, especially when they're competent. And if they are intelligent, if they are competent, if they're able to actually accomplish things and hold it together a little bit, many aren't. They may even seem exceptional. They might seem like especially convincing, especially charismatic, right? Especially competent. And that's because traits associated with psychopaths, they're charismatic, they're glib, charming, and that makes them likable often. Not always, right? Because if they're high on kind of the antisocial behavior faucet, you might think, this is someone that's highly aggressive, in which case they might kind of balance that out. But in a lot of cases, they can come across as someone that you like, especially on a superficial level if you don't know them that well, that you always got along with, that you thought was a good person, not someone that you thought of as, kind of rebel without a cause, bad boy, guy getting into a lot of trouble. Next slide. Now we can look at this paper a little bit and the evolution of psychopathy. Where did it come from and why? Because this is, a bad behavior. It's bad for individuals, mostly. It's bad for the people they interact with, almost always, and bad for society as a whole. So we might ask, why did evolution select for things that are bad? Of course, evolution does not care about badness. Evolution cares about reproductive fitness. What helps the individual survive and what helps them produce offspring that survive to a viable age for those offspring to thus produce offspring, right? Reproductive fitness. That leads us to the sexual exploitation hypothesis, right? If we have antisocial behavior in a small percentage of the population, or any small percentage of behavior, we do have to ask, why has this persisted? If it's truly bad, as far as reproductive fitness is concerned, not as far as ethics or morality are concerned, why has it not been bred out of the population? Well, it probably isn't entirely destructive for reproductive fitness. For some people, it might enhance it, and that's why the behavior has persisted. Because psychopathy, heritable, like, all of personality and behavior, at least partially heritable. So the sexual exploitation hypothesis talks about special design features for subverting female mate choice, right? So it's related to sexual decision making in this case, and we will look a little bit more into that. What does this mean to subvert female mate choice? Looking at the next slide here, okay? One way is simply sexual coercion, right? Coercion, force, violence sexually. That will do it. Maybe in a modern environment less, even in, the last 2,000 years or so. This is something that's been very, very punished strictly. But in an ancestral environment, right, in the Pleistocene, for the last, 200,000 years of human evolutionary history, did force result in higher reproductive fitness? Perhaps, and therefore, less empathetic hominids, early human beings that were more aggressive, perhaps that benefited them. So that's one way. We know that psychopaths put up a facade of desirable traits and behaviors. They mimic what women like, So that's subverting choice, right? By kind of creating an illusion that the person being picked is something that they're not. And psychopaths also have an actual drive for attractive traits above other individuals. The same things that women kind of find attractive, at least some of those. For example, psychopaths care about their image, so they enhance physical appearance. They care about status, power, wealth, right? And those are things that we know, again, cross-culturally, we've had large cross-cultural studies on this, tend to be attractive to women. So if a psychopath is competent and they have a drive for all of these traits, status, whatever it may be, and they're able to accomplish that, okay, then you also have a way that this behavior, these personality tendencies can emerge and be selected for. Let's go on. So quick slide on social cheating, right? And we're not talking about cheating in relationships, but cheating as far as bending the rules of society, the norms of society, breaking the law, breaking the rules. This can be beneficial for an individual if they don't get caught, right? If they're able to acquire, for example, resources, let's say through theft, they don't get caught, now they have more resources. If they do get caught, of course, then they could be punished, they could be exiled, right? They could be executed, whatever the case may be in that case. And there's some research that indicated that psychopathy may actually be more common in cities. Why? Because they're more anonymous, because they can get away with it more, perhaps. So at least in some niche conditions, or for some individuals, this kind of bending of the rules, this social cheating, can be adaptive. Let's go on and look. We know that psychopathy is related to a fast life history strategy, right? Life history theory, which was originally used to describe differences in reproduction in animals, right? An elephant, a human being, slow life history compared to other animals. Why? Long gestation period. We invest a lot in a small number of offspring to make sure that that one baby survives, basically, and makes it. You know, a puppy, a salmon, or something like that. You know, they're having a large litter. They don't care if half of them die. The babies are born a little bit less developed, or, excuse me, I should say, usually they're born a little bit more developed because they're on their own. Not a lot of parental investment or care going into those babies. So what do we know is associated with this fast life history strategy, okay? Earlier sexual debut is one. So these individuals have sex earlier in life, usually younger as teens. They have more sexual partners over the lifetime. They have an inability to form long-term romantic connections, so more short-term orientation. More breakups, which is of course related to more sexual partners. If you stay in a relationship for 15 years, you know, it doesn't matter how attractive you are, you will have very few sexual partners. If you stay in a relationship for 1 year at a time, you can be less attractive, but you're going to accumulate more sexual partners, which is why we don't see a strong relationship between physical attractiveness and lifetime sexual partner count. We see they're more likely to engage in like infidelity and mate poaching, so more likely to pursue kind of a dualistic sexual strategy, these men, and higher sociosexuality. They're more open to casual sex, right? More open to short-term relationships and sexual opportunism as well. So imagine the guy who stays, you know, to the last call at a bar and takes a girl home who's like really drunk. He doesn't care that much what she looks like, just wants to hit it, right? Sexual opportunism, that's an example. And there's been research, you know, on the dark triad, which measures trait psychopathy. Why is this associated with more sexual partners over the lifetime? One reason, you know, is because there is actually seems to be a relationship between dark triad traits and what women find attractive. But another seems to be that individuals who score higher in the dark triad have lower standards, right? They're more likely to have sex with people they're not that attracted to, or their bar for being attracted is simply lower. They're sexual opportunists. And if you are a sexual opportunist, you're going to have more sexual partners than if you're someone, you know, with a high orientation toward monogamy, looking for a committed relationship, or someone with high standards, or someone who will not take advantage of questionable sexual situations. Let's move on. Deception mentioned throughout this, but this is important because this is really a key feature of psychopathy. Deception, manipulation. So we know that this is something psychopaths do, that they hone their skills at it, pretty much a core behavior, you know. And we know that women also like certain traits, right? We mentioned resources, status, and power, but women also like behavioral and interpersonal traits, certain traits for relationships that make someone more attractive to want to stay and be with. Commitment, investment, kindness, love, emotional connection, okay? Psychopaths mimic all of this. They don't just lie and say, you know, I have $1 billion, you know, I drive whatever kind of fancy car. They say, you know, for a one-night stand, something like, yeah, I'm going to love you forever. I want to be with you, you know, until they get sex and then they ghost. Okay. That's kind of what we're looking at here. This mimicry of those behaviors. And if someone does that, by the way, if you know, if they say, yeah, we're going to be together, and then they have sex and then they ghost, that doesn't mean that they're a psychopath. You can't tell just from looking at individual behaviors, except that that's something, you know, maybe psychopaths would do a little bit more on average, that they would be willing to do. Just kind of as an example I pulled out of thin air. So that's something to consider, that psychopaths mimic all of these behaviors that are attractive to women. And these are long-term relationship traits, right? Because most women have a strong orientation for long-term relationships. Most do not have a strong orientation toward short-term relationships. They're highly oriented towards monogamy. Most sex that occurs within relationships, that sort of a thing. So the traits that psychopaths tend to mimic tend to be normal person traits, right? The kinds of things that would indicate to a woman that they are interested in them and serve as a good relationship partner, basically. Let's go on. What else do we know? And I mentioned this briefly. Deceptive self-enhancement. So we know that psychopaths are more likely to deceptively enhance their own physical appearance. I think there has been some research on this as far as image editing online, right? So modern manifestation of this, more likely to use filters. I don't know if there's been research on this specifically, but you might ask people who score higher in something like psychopathy on the dark triad, would they be more likely to catfish? Would they be more likely to kind of take those kind of pictures on Tinder where, they show their face, but they don't show you their body, and they show up at the date and you think, I did not know they looked like this. Those kinds of things. And aside from physical self-enhancement, also more likely to enhance their own accomplishments or status in life, right? So bragging about themselves a lot, exaggerating like what they do, their role at work, making things up, all of that. Next one here. So, as I mentioned, psychopaths in that case often do not resemble the bad boy that we have the image of, right? Be it like just a normal criminal or kind of the rogue image, the macho image of a bad boy. They often mimic more a normal person who would be a good, promising partner in a long-term relationship. So it's not just criminals are hot or bad boys are hot, and that's why women like psychopaths, right? And as far as that goes, this gets mixed up a lot. People talk about women who are attracted to actual psychopaths, murderers and all of that in criminal, right? Hybristophilia, I think it is called. And there's been a little bit of research on that, not very much, that indicate, okay, a very small percentage of women, about half of those women are actually attracted to the violence of the act, to the crime itself. The other half form kind of a romantic attachment to the murderer. And so you'll see these women like writing to these men in prison and that sort of a thing. But that's different from like bad boys are hot. And it's probably also different from the kind of woman that gets roped into a relationship with a psychopath who thinks she's getting a normal guy, right? Because these are women that know offhand, like, I'm attracted to this guy because he's a violent criminal, because he's not a normal guy. Whereas psychopaths in the wild, they have the mask on, right? The mask of sanity. They are passing as a normal guy. And that is essentially how they're roping in normal women, right? Going into the results of this paper that I mentioned at the beginning, when we look at the different facets of psychopathy, I think this can kind of help understand what makes it attractive and what doesn't. Because we just say psychopathy and we think like murderer or criminal or whatever, when that might not be what's really going on. Let's look at the results. So, psychopathy overall, it explained about 6% of the variance in attractiveness after physical attractiveness was controlled for. So we do see an effect of psychopathy, not large, but it's there. But of the 4 factors, only the lifestyle factor was predictive, okay? Individually, as a model, they all contribute somewhat, but the lifestyle factor here, strongest correlation. Let's go forward and look at that a little bit more in depth. So we see total psychopathy at 30.3, and we see lifestyle at 0.44. The other 3, not significant relationships. So it's the lifestyle facet of psychopathy that seems to enhance attractiveness through behavior. Let's go on and look. What does that mean? Looking back at the facets from the HARE checklist, okay? Stimulation-seeking individuals, impulsive, often irresponsible. So these are individuals that are going to be more open to risk. They're going to approach more, right? They're going to probably come across as more confident and extroverted, that sort of thing. So that explains a lot of it. This one on here that says parasitic orientation. There's something called love bombing, which, people say narcissists do a lot. People that score high in the dark triad do it, and psychopaths as well. They will put a lot of investment into, after a few dates, just love bombing the person, just kind of doing that. And often, after a period of time, that will convert to kind of taking from the relationship. So these are individuals that may depend on a romantic partner, not just emotionally, which is normal to depend on a romantic partner emotionally, but for things like, I need you to give me money, that kind of a thing. The other 3, they didn't. Surprisingly, the interpersonal ones didn't. For me, it's surprising. Why? Because I would think, glib and superficial charm, grandiose self-worth, and even the lying could be things that contribute to the attractiveness, but this is, this study was done after a video recording of individuals who were scored in psychopathy. So it's kind of like what you would expect at first meeting. Those could contribute down the road, right? If the person is enhancing their image a lot, falsely. The other one, lack of remorse, guilt, shallow affect, all of the affect ones, doesn't seem to be related at all. Perhaps not surprising. Those are things that are not going to help you in a relationship. They're not going to help you in a first encounter. You do have to have some kind of, emotional intelligence, so to speak. And I know some people, if I say emotional intelligence, will be critical of it. There's some debate. I guess I should say, well, I'm on that side of the debate that says, it's probably not an independent thing. It probably describes personality. The big five seems to explain the variance in emotional intelligence, but whatever. Using it in kind of more of a pop psych way. Yeah, you got to be good with people. And if you have, no remorse or guilt, shallow affect, no empathy, that's going to, kind of affect you maybe even right off the bat as far as shallow affect, low empathy goes. And then the last one, right, kind of the behavioral antisocial ones, okay. Poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, didn't predict it. So these are not the things that make the psychopath attractive. It's their initial behavior that comes across as confident, probably extroverted, exciting, fun to be with. Final thoughts on this paper, okay, and what we covered. Psychopaths, they're probably not attractive just because they're bad, right? Most people don't know that psychopaths are psychopaths. They don't find them to be so when they end up in a relationship with a psychopath. Aside from, as I mentioned, the people who, down the line, that small percentage of women who have an attraction, to killers or whatever, but, not a normative group by any means. They tend to be attractive instead because they fool people into thinking they're not bad, right? They often, psychopaths, when they form relationships, it's kind of with women who are normal, more or less. They may find women who are easier to manipulate, and that might simply be an effect of the personality of the two and not even deliberate. Why? Because women who are less easy to manipulate may see through it more easily and bounce, right? And psychopaths may learn over time even how to pick those women out. But, being a little bit easy to manipulate doesn't make a woman like abnormal or something. Many people are like that. So they're targeting normal women. And when I say that, I mean psychopaths aren't going after women that love psychopaths. They're passing as normal, and they are forming relationships with women who tend to think that they're normal, good guys, basically. And as far as bad boys, maybe most of them are not quite as bad as you would think, even if they have some kind of history or some kind of antisocial behavior going on. Most people have some kind of, mixture of good and bad within them, some kind of antisocial behavior going on. Normatively, most human behavior on a day-to-day basis is pro-social. We wouldn't have very complex society if it was not. But that's something to consider, that a lot of this bad boy thing is more of an image. They may be desirable for reasons other than simply being bad. They may come across similarly to the psychopath as simply more confident, more assertive, or stronger, right? Traits that are neutral or good, but that may be more visible when someone is engaging in, kind of that image of the bad boy, or even if they're engaging in actual antisocial behavior in that case. Psychopaths, on the other hand, may not. They might try to hide that behavior completely. You might not even find out until it's too late, and then at the end of the day, you might realize, wow, that was a psychopath all along. I had no idea, but it was certainly not because, there was a desire for that from the beginning. So the next video I make, I'm going to talk a little bit more about bad boys. It's a whole other topic. I'm going to talk about nice guys as well and go into these different archetypes. People talk about them. They tend to mean different things. But for now, this video on psychopathy, attractiveness, all of that. Hoped you liked it. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, and I will make another for you very soon.